So thank you all for coming to this event today, our book writing event for ethnobotanical research, where we have our lovely guest speakers, Dr. Rick Stepp from the University of Florida and Ina Vandebroek from the New York Botanical Garden. So obviously very nice of them to volunteer their time to come in and talk to us today. I have to give you a mandatory reminder that as a society, we are always looking for new members to join. Joining the society is at a low cost for students, and it gives you access to more events like this, as well as access to the Journal of Economic Botany, both in order to read it and publish in it. So please do consider signing up for the society afterwards. As I mentioned, please keep your mics on mute throughout the event. And we will have 2 question periods during which you will be allowed to ask questions. We'll get you to just unmute your mic for questions and then remute directly afterwards. That way we don't have too much background noise during the talking. So we are going to hop in and get started, and we're going to let Dr. Rick Stepp start us off.
Hi, first let me say thanks for organizing this. It's a great idea, and I'm honored to have been asked. There are lots of other people who've written way more than me and have a lot more experience publishing as well. So I'm still an apprentice at all this, but I do hope that I can share a few stories. And after all, writing books is really about telling stories, and I think that the better we are at telling stories, the better it will convey so much important knowledge and wisdom from our discipline. I'm going to turn this off because I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell. We've sort of loosely structured this in as much as I'm going to talk more in general about the writing within the field of ethnobotany and economic botany. Talk about some of the genres within the field, and Ina's going to talk a little more focused on the nuts and bolts in terms of publishing and editing. Either of us could have taken on either role, so and certainly during the question and answer period, we can feel free to direct questions either way that you see fit. But in preparation for this, I sort of made a mess of my library, and there's books all over the place, and pulling these together. It was a really nice experience to go through and look at some books that I hadn't seen in a while. It was bittersweet in some ways because some of the books that I have today to show you, the authors are no longer on this planet with us. And I had a professor tell me one time that one of the few ways that we achieve mortality is one, either through our students, in the sense that our ideas carry on, and the other way we achieve immortality is through our writings and our books. And so we'll share some immortal folks with you today, and also some folks that are still with us. I also see a lot of old friends and some new friends on this call, so thanks for joining. And if I mischaracterize anything, please feel free to interject and correct me. Obviously, in a field as broad as ours, there's been thousands and thousands and thousands of books published, and so I can't even begin to scratch the surface in terms of what's out there. So there's a lot that I'm not going to mention, and so anyone that's not mentioned doesn't mean that I don't think it's an amazing book. Just that some of this was a bit random in terms of me pulling stuff off the shelf. But I do think a lot of these books are exemplary. Some of them have won the book award for the Society of Economic Botany or the book award in the Society of Ethnobiology. And so there's a lot to explore. But in as much as the craft of writing that I wanted to talk about in ways to learn how to write better, I would say one of my biggest mentor actually isn't from academia. He's no longer with us. He's a friend of mine, Harry Cruz. That's Harry back in the 1970s. This is an amazing book, by the way. It's called Childhood: A Biography of Place. Harry grew up as a sharecropper in rural Georgia in the 1930s and 40s, and totally self-taught to read, and fell in love with books at a really early age. And as a teenager, and he didn't have access to a library, as you might imagine, but as a teenager, he went to work for a wealthier woman who had a library, and she would let him take books out of her personal library, and that's where he learned to read and really fell in love with fiction. And so Harry taught me a lot about the craft of writing as a novelist. He was pretty prolific. He at one period of his life, he wrote a book a year for about 12 years. And I asked him one time, "Sir, how did you maintain this?" This was after that level of intense productivity. So how did you maintain this productivity. He said, well, there was one thing I had to do, and this is what he would tell everybody, is that he put his ass in the chair. And he, Harry was prone to a lot of straightforward language, I suppose. But I would sit there and I would not let myself get up until I had 250 words in the page. I said, oh, well, that's not that much. He said, yeah, but, and especially with writing novels, so much goes on behind the scenes and crafting in your mind before you actually sit down, in his case, in a typewriter, or, for most of us nowadays, a computer. And the idea was, though, that you dedicate that time and you don't get up. And he would sometimes sit for 3 or 4 hours before he had 250 words. But at that point, no matter how much it was flowing, he'd stop and go about the rest of his day. And you think about, well, 250 words isn't that much, but if you do that every single day, in half a year, you have more than enough for a book in terms of output. And so, you can write a book every year. And I think that some of the more prolific writers amongst us follow similar strategies. Now, of course, academic writing and nonfiction writing is quite a bit different, because so much goes on in terms of the research beforehand and the data analysis. But I do think once you get to that point of actually crafting the book, apart from the sort of mundane type entry of information, that good writing demands the time to really reflect and to develop it in a way that makes for beautiful writing and important poetic writing. So with that in mind, I'll tell a few more stories about various books. Looking on the shelves, though, I like I said, I pulled a lot of different books, and you do see these genres emerge in our field. Probably the most straightforward one is the ethnobotany of X, and these are undertakings to more or less comprehensively describe the ethnobotany of a particular culture, or in some cases an entire region. But even within those types of books, there's quite a bit of variability in how they're done and what the output is. One of my favorites is written by Bob Lachlan. We lost Bob this year to COVID. It was quite sad. He was still going strong until that happened. But this, the interesting backstory on this book, this is A Flower and a Man, a Zotziel botany of Zina Katan. This is sort of a companion work to the work that I'll talk about in a minute that Brent Berlin did with the Zeltalmai. This is down in Highland Chiapas, one of the most studied places in the world by anthropologists and all sorts of other social scientists and biologists as well. But what's interesting is that Bob was not an ethnobotanist. He was a linguist, an anthropological linguist, and he was intensely concerned with documenting the language and, by extension, the culture of the Tzotzil. Went down to Chiapas in the early 60s, basically went local in the sense that he became totally fluent in the language and was sort of adopted as into Tzotzil families, and worked there for 15 years or so, and decided to write a dictionary. And the dictionary ended up being this really important work. Took him another 10 years. It was actually one of these books that they used to have, the US government used to have, or a conservative politician rather in the US government used to have an award for the biggest waste of government money. And his dictionary won this award, the Golden Fleece Award or something, which he was quite proud of, which, because obviously the person given this award was ignorant of how important this research was. But in any case, he wrote this dictionary, and then Dennis Breedlove, who's not this dictionary, this is the actual book, but I'll get to the point in a second. Dennis Breedlove came along, picked up his dictionary, Bob's dictionary, flipped through it and said, great, but where are the plants? And so Bob said, oh, there's a plant here and a plant there. I got, there's at least 20 or 30 plant names in here. He said, yeah, but that's not even close to what you need to really get at this incredible ethnobotanical knowledge of the Tzotzil. So he said, all right, I'll add an addendum to the dictionary, and I'll spend another 6 months. And Dennis, I heard this secondhand, but Dennis supposedly shook his head and said, I think you need about 10 years. Dennis was right. So they started collaborating together. And 10 years later, this came out. This is actually the abridged version, that they put 2 volumes together. But what's really beautiful about this work is that in addition to being a really comprehensive ethnobotany of Tzotzil, which is the first volume, The entire second half is all of these incredible stories and myths and rituals about plants, and all of the rich ethnographic context that really grounds the work. And it's not just plant names; it's much more than that. So anyway, if you're looking for an example like that, highly recommend that. I see Dan's on the call here. I couldn't miss this book that I'm sure many of you have or have seen. It functions as a really great doorstop, but it's also incredibly beautiful read. It's well written, and it's a reference, but I consult it all the time because I just like reading it, and every time I pick it up, I learn something. Also noticed that this book has a surprising way of following me around the world to different places, and so I've now seen this book in probably a dozen different places I've been to. And not just in Ethnobotanist Library, which would be the obvious place, but really strange. I'll share two of them. One of them was last January. I was at the University of Kyoto, and there was a scholar there, but not an ethnobotanist, but he had a lot of English language books, and this was sitting on a shelf. I said, "Oh, why? I know the author of that book." He said, I just enjoy reading Ethnobotany. I don't really do it, but it's just and I really like that book. So I was like, oh, great. Also saw it. I was visiting the restaurant Noma in Copenhagen that probably you're familiar with. It's won the best restaurant in the world a few times. They have a really nice library of different food books and ethnobotany books, and this was sort of front and center sitting in there. So here you have a restaurant in Copenhagen, learning from the wisdom of Native Americans and the knowledge that Dan Norman has imparted to us through that. There's a lot of other of these large references. I'll just show you a few more. This one doesn't get seen a lot because it's hard to find, but it's absolutely beautiful work. Julia Morton, who many of you may be familiar with, Atlas of Medicinal Plants of Middle America. Great reference. And I mention these because we need more of these, because despite having all these, and this is also a great door stopper, all these significant works that are comprehensive, we still have so much that has never been published or has never been even written down. We consider there's approximately 7,000 languages out there, and each one of those has at least an ethnobotany associated with it, if not multiple. And how many of these are out there? I mean, of course, this is an entire region. Dan's book is an entire region. But really, it's fewer than 100 that we could say, that book is relatively comprehensive for the ethnobotany of a particular culture. And we need more of those. It's such a crucial part of survival of the human species, obviously survival of language and culture associated with ethnobotany. And it allows us to do comparative work, which I think we only begin to scratch the surface of what's out there for that type of thing. I had this one too. This is another absolutely beautiful book, this Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants. Which brings me to another comprehensive book, the single authored monograph, or I'm sorry, not single authored with Dennis Breedlove, but monograph on the Tzeltal Maya. And I mentioned this one that Brent was with my major advisor, and so I learned a lot about the work behind this book. This was published in 1974. But what's really amazing, in as much as it's a comprehensive portrait of plants for the Tzeltal Maya in Tanahapa, they only worked with about 4 main people to make this happen. Now they interviewed more people than that, obviously, but the idea is that it doesn't require, in a place that has intact ethnobotanical knowledge, you can gather a comprehensive portrait. And there's 1,500 plants in here, about 2,200 total species within Tzeltal Maya land. So they're, it's comprehensive as it gets. So I highly recommend that. Did somebody have a hand up? I know I saw on the screen. Anyway, feel free to interject as I move through this. Another, I think, really significant work, pretty much everything Nancy writes is significant, Nancy Turner, but this came out not too long ago, won the award. And again, in as much as it's both a systematic cataloging of botanical names and ethnobotanical knowledge, but also all the richness in the same way that Bob Laughlin brought it in for the Zote seal. Nancy brings it into her neck of the woods and really makes ethnobotany rich. So it's that humanistic tradition that goes hand in hand with the science that Nancy is so good at capturing. And in the process, writing in a way that is really poetic and beautiful. So we have lots to I think, draw from as we write our own books. And that was another lesson that I learned early on, is that good writers read a lot. And so, if you want to write, you have to be a reader at the same time, and you have to consume as much out there that is really good. Another great reference work, Cultural History of Plants, Sir Ian, and our recent president, Mark Nesbitt, that highly recommend. There's a whole nother genre that I'll just mention briefly, but I've read some fun and really entertaining books. It'd be sort of the swashbuckling approach in ethnobotany. This one you probably don't know because it hasn't been widely distributed, but it's a classic of ethnomedicine and adventure. You see on the back, Schultes tells us that it's a book worth reading. This came out in, I believe, in the first edition was in 1961. Witch Doctor's Apprentice: Hunting for Medicine in the Amazon by Nicole Maxwell. Quite frankly, a lot of these books are written by men, and they bring a fairly masculine approach to them. And I think sometimes that can be be problematic. And so it's nice to read a book by a woman also that's out with that spirit of adventure and running around the Amazon talking to indigenous peoples. There's been a lot written in sort of the for general audiences, and I think we need to do more of that, because if we don't write those books, somebody else comes along and does it. Now, sometimes they do a great job of it, and I think one of the best examples that somebody that I think we can claim as kin, even though he has, as far as I know, no formal background in ethnobotany, is Michael Pollan, Botany of Desire, several other books. Pollan wants to get it right, and he also wants to tell a really good story. He's got a background in scientific communications and journalism, so he does a really good job of talking about plants. But doesn't mean that we can't do that too. I mean, most of us probably aren't going to write a national bestseller, and I don't know how many copies this is sold, but I'm sure it's in the hundreds of thousands. But we can learn from it and begin to develop that rapport with the general public. Because if we don't do it, as I mentioned, other people do it, and it's also we're doing the discipline a disservice. We wonder why we're so small and fragmented, and why at many universities there's only one or maybe two of us. Part of it is that the general public doesn't know who we are, and the only way they're going to learn who we are is through writing entertaining and informative books. There's been a few other ones out there. This one was big in the 90s, Earthly Goods, Medicine Hunting in the Rainforest. I mentioned this because several of our members are featured in here. Brad Bennett, I think they took, it's been a while since I read this, but in any case, this was more of a journalist going off and saying, hey, ethnobotanists have really interesting stories. I'm going to go follow them around, trail them, and then write a book about it. So again, not written by an ethnobotanist, but about ethnobotanists, as sort of a biography, so to speak. Gary Navin, can't miss. Talk about prolific. I can't tell you how many books I have by Gary on my shelf. They come out faster than I can buy them. But Gary is one of our own, and in the sense of having a PhD and working in ethnobotany, and then taking that research and making it readily available to the public. Culture as a Habitat, I think, has been highly influential to a lot of people. It's not strictly ethnobotany, it's about a sort of broader vision of ethnobotany, but a lot to learn from. And then he has several books that focus on particular taxa, why some like it hot, so looking at chili peppers and sort of within a broader context of cultural and biological diversity. Gene Anderson's Ecology of the Heart, I highly recommend. Looking at the subtitle, Motion, Belief in the Environment, filled with ethnobotany, but again, towards the eye of a general public and having that audience understand why this stuff's important. So it's not just about the plant names and that this is an interesting plant for food or medicine, but how this knowledge ties in to appreciation and conservation of the biophysical environment and the role of emotionality in that, and that it's not just all about the science. Don't want to go over time here, but in the brief time left, well, another, I think, just brilliant writer who has gone too soon is Justin Nolan. This is his book. This was his dissertation. I mentioned this is, pretty common for people, or not common, but a lot of times dissertations get turned into books. There's a lot of resources out there to turn your dissertation into a book. So if you're in the process of writing your dissertation right now, and you're considering it, think about how you craft your dissertation, because there's some ways to craft dissertations that make it easier to ultimately turn into a book. And if you ever read Justin's book here, Wild Harvest in the Heartland, you'll see this really intense concern with the wordsmithing, and it doesn't read like a dry dissertation. And it's something that is it's quite nice in the way he approaches it. Edited volumes. I think, Ina will talk more about this, but I do want to mention, and not just edited volumes, but rather book series. There's several different book series out there that are ethnobotanically friendly or exclusively devoted to ethnobotany. One that I really enjoy everything that comes out, and truth in advertising here, I'm on the editorial board, but I don't do too much for them. But this is Bergen Books. The volume is Studies in Environmental Anthropology and Ethnobiology that Roy Ellen is a series editor for. And I just to give a plug for Ina and Andrea's book, it's absolutely beautiful and really important book that came out in that series. So read that if you haven't. Our sister organization, Society of Ethnobiology, started a book series recently, Contributions in Ethnobiology. A lot of great stuff coming out in this. They started this series, from my understanding, is really a way to bridge some longer articles that they were getting that they really wanted to put in the Journal of Ethnobiology, but that it just made more sense as standalone books. And so they've done some nice work, and they're continuing to grow that series. There's a series that Bob Vokes, editor of Economic Botany, and myself, our series editor on through Springer Nature, called Ethnobiology, and we've put out, I don't know, we've probably had about 15 or 20 books now. A lot of really nice books have come out that I'm quite happy with. I will say, and hopefully no one from Springer is on this call or watches this because they might get mad at me, but they charge a bit too much for these. I understand why they do it. It's their pricing model is really geared towards library acquisition. But in any case, I wish that these could be cheaply available for other folks throughout the world. Oh, and one more in the Bergen series that I find really useful is this Landscape Ethnoecology by Gene Hunn and Leslie Johnson. So that is, in a very brief amount of time, a quick tour of the world of books in ethnobotany and some of my thoughts. I will now turn the floor over to Ina. And, oh, wait, do I have questions now? I'm sorry for, yes. All right, open it up to questions, and then we'll have Ina's presentation, then we'll do a joint, or she'll answer some questions, and we'll do joint questions at the end. I see some questions that came in oh, this is great. I think everyone can see this, but well, nice comment. Michael Pollan told me in 2016 that if he started over again, he'd probably become an ethnobotanist. Let's tell Michael that it's never too late to go back to school, and we can get him to formally become one of our own. Yes, I will email everyone these books that I mentioned. And Carson said that the recording will be out there. So I guess this presentation in and of itself will achieve some form of immortality for me, but I will write it up.
Okay, maybe one question for some of the student members is, what sort of advice would you have for students who are sitting down to try and write up their research as a book? You said try and write your dissertation in a way that it's easily changed over, but what else would be very important to keep in mind?
Yes. So, well, depending on what field you're in, there's some of the large professional societies have workshops at their annual meetings, how to turn your dissertation into a book. The American Anthropological Association, for example, does that every year. I've never taken that workshop, but I imagine it's pretty useful. I seem to recall similar workshops in other, these large professional society of geographers, things like that. I don't know that the BSA has ever done something like that, but it might be worth asking. So there's that as a resource. There's also dozens of books with that exact title, How to Turn Your Dissertation into a Book. I can't recommend any particular one, but go to your library and check them out and see what they say. The other thing that I would highly recommend, though, is find some dissertations that have been turned into books. You can look at the dissertation, you can look at the book, you can see what changed in the process. But generally, look at what a good dissertation is. There's a dissertation award that's given out every year. Every once in a while, there's a book that's related to our field that wins it. So have a look at that, and that should get you started. Talking to presses is always useful too. Some presses facilitate those efforts better than others. And so you may want to just see what's come out. And not every dissertation should be turned into a book. So I don't, it really depends on what your interests are, what material that you have. Sometimes people do these hybrids where they publish several journal articles and then turn it into a book, and then publish the rest of it as rest of the dissertation as a book.
Okay, and we have a question from Katie. Who helped you write your first book, and how fun was that first experience? So can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, well, the first book that was an edited volume, so it wasn't a single authored monograph. But this, just as a shout out to my two co-editors, Felice Wyndham and Becky Zarger. We did this in grad school, and it was so much fun doing this. It was a lot of work. It ended up being, I don't know how many pages, 720 pages. But this grew out of the International Congress of, I think Christian has it on the shelf. This is another one that just kind of shows up in strange and weird places, which is kind of nice to see to this day. But it was so fun to work with all the authors. And we didn't plan it this way, but just that Congress was so magical in the number of people that showed up to it and decided to participate in this book. And so it's this great who's who of ethnobotany, even today. I just on the back contributors include Gene Anderson, Memory Elvin Lewis, Mary Eubanks, Dean Hunn, Christian Kabuye, David Lentz, I mean, you name it, Gary Nabum. And so I really got to know all these people. And of course, pretty much everybody in this book had way more experience than we did at putting a book together. And they never were paternalistic about it. They never said, why are a bunch of grad students doing this? Why should somebody that knows what they're doing be taking care of this? They were really, really helpful. And so I learned a lot of stuff about editing in the process of and working with Becky and Felice and putting this together. So that's somewhat of an uncommon experience, but the point is that you can do that too, right? I mean, there's no reason that just because you're in grad school, you can't put an edited volume together. So that's what I learned a lot about just the publishing enterprise that way. I was also on the board of the American Anthropological Association at the time that they were transitioning to online publishing. And it may be hard to believe for those of you that are students right now that it wasn't that long ago that publishing didn't exist online. And I remember even when I was in grad school, when these online journals were starting, people were like, oh, stay away from those because that's not a legitimate journal. Now every journal is online. Some of them still have paper copies, but there's this sense of that a journal somehow not legitimate because it's online that's gone. But in the process of working with the American Anthropological Association, at the time they had, 20 something odd journals, and seeing how they approached that transition taught me quite a bit about the publishing enterprise as well. couple of questions here that have come in. Jessica, yes, books are recommended for folks who want. I will, I haven't checked the books out in a while that people have these advice sort of books, but I will see if I can find one. But I agree that some of these are pretty dated and they have very much this sort of paternalistic approach to them. And yes, reading Justin's book would be more helpful than the how-to books. Because it's true, people that write well, you can learn a lot from. I'm fortunate enough to have a really great novelist that's a neighbor of mine, Lauren Groff. And so I talked to her about publishing a lot. And again, she doesn't write, nothing to do with academia, nothing to do with ethnobotany in particular. But she writes really good novels, and just being able to just run into her on the street and have a chat with her about publishing has been, I learn a lot from other people's crafts and reading her work, of course. Yes, Andrew's book, Cultivating Knowledge by Technology, is great dissertation just turned into a book. I should have mentioned that one as well. How are book weight versus articles in terms of scholars' productivity output that is considered towards their academic tenure process? It really varies by institution. I can talk about my own institution. It's a large public university, Research One. They generally count a book as 3 to 5 articles, and that could be fair. That could be really unfair, depending on if you have a 2,000-page book that took you 10 years to write. I would say it's worth more than 5 articles. So yeah, it's a rough guideline. I think at the end of the day, if you do good work, your productivity will get recognized, and not worry too much about the bean counting of how many articles you have versus books. And by extension, don't create a book just to create a book. It needs to make sense. It needs to, the format needs to fit the work that you're drawing from. Yes, Tim John's Origin of Human Diet and Medicine. Tim's dissertation was one of these award winners back in 1985, and that's an absolutely brilliant book.
Rick, can I interject here?
Yes,
also,
please.
Answering Betsabe's question, right? I think it depends on the scientific discipline. In the social sciences, I think writing books is valued in comparison more than in the natural sciences. That's just a fact. But and I'll talk more about it. I think there are different reasons why writing books is also good in the natural sciences, but really specifically, has this helped my career? Not necessarily, but I found it from a personal point of view necessary, besides articles, to write books.
Yeah, good point.
I'm just going to quickly throw in, for those of you who are missing where the questions are coming from, a lot of these are coming in from the chat, as well as other good ideas on books that we should look at. So if you're not looking at the chat, please do so.
Yes, and back to the chat. Let's see, it would be great to get insight on how to best approach publishers, especially for books targeting wider public awareness. What is the best pitching strategy? What works? What types of agreements are out there? Let's hold off on that question, because I suspect that Ina will address that somewhat, but we can certainly talk more about it. But yeah, finding the right press is crucial. There's, apart from the series that I mentioned, there's some presses that really support ethnobotany. University of Arizona, for example, University of California Press, in terms of scholarly presses, in terms of university-based presses, sorry, in terms of other presses that are scholarly, not necessarily university affiliated. Timber Press that published Dan's book and a lot of other great books. I have an entire shelf of books that are just Timber Press books. I mean, they're not organized that way, but if I pulled them together, it would fill up more than a shelf. So yeah, it really depends, but finding the right match with a publisher is very important. I did mention Gary Nabhan in response to Irene's question. He's in the file here. I think probably his best known work, or at least the most influential one, is Culture of the Habitat, but lots of other ones.
All right, great. Thank you, Rick. If anyone else has more questions, you're free to add them in at the end. We'll have a joint question period for both of our speakers. Now we will hand things over to Ina to talk about the publishing side of things.
Okay, let me start by sharing my screen. I prepared 15 slides. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Karsten and the student leadership at the Society for inviting me to talk about editing and publishing a scholarly book. And so I prepared 15 slides that I organized around 5 questions. And first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Ina Vandebroek. I'm an associate curator at the New York Botanical Garden. I'm the Caribbean program director there. And my research is in collaboration with Caribbean communities in the Caribbean and their diaspora communities living in New York City, looking into their traditional knowledge systems for plants used as foods and medicines. So we will be talking about publishing a book, and the first question that needs to be addressed is, why write a book? What's the merit of writing a book? Why writing a book instead of writing 3 scientific papers, for example? Then once you've settled on the fact that you want to write a book, the next question that pops up is, what kind of book do you want to write? What's the format of that book? And Rick has already commented on that, but I want to show you some examples from the series that I've been editing, that I'm editor of, Advances in Economic Botany, to give you some ideas of what kind of formats of books in ethnobotany that you could aim for. But that doesn't mean that that's the only structure and that's the only rigid structure that you should use. I think it's very important for me as an editor to emphasize that you should also be able to bring your own creativity to editors and to publishers. So let's say you've chosen a format of your book. You have a specific topic, but how are you going to approach this topic? That will be the next question that I will address in my slides. Then you have your manuscript developed, or you have the idea of how you're going to develop, but how do you get your book idea published, right? This, like Rick said, there are a number of publishers out there. Let's say you've settled on a publisher and you want to approach the publisher with that idea. Let's say you've successfully navigated those waters, you've jumped through all these hoops, you've answered the questions for yourself, you developed the manuscript, you've submitted it to the publisher, and what happens next? And what is important in this whole process, and Rick said that also, I've been taking notes while Rick was speaking, is perseverance, right? It is a continued commitment and engagement. It's not something that you say, oh, I'm going to write a book in 3 months. It might, but if you have nothing else to do in those 3 months, so likely you're in for 6 months to a year. So the first thing to start with is to choose the best environment for you. And not all of us might be able to sit at the beach, but wherever you are in your environment, you need to be comfortable. You need to have that space so you can get into that frame in that mindset, in that frame of mind to write your book. So let's see now why writing a book. What are the why publish your work as a book? What are the advantages? And I would say the most important thing is that writing a book gives you the opportunity to go broad and deep on a subject. So it is like a synthesis of research. Whereas if you're writing a scientific article, you're often limited. It's a very structured format. You have a research question. You have to explain methodologically how you carried out the research, then you're presenting your results, and then you're giving an interpretation to these results, drawing in on the previously published literature. So in a book, you can provide more of that much needed ethnographic context. So here is an example, and this is also from the series Advances in Economic Botany, where there is information provided on almost 600 species of plants used by the Shuar communities in Ecuador, but at the same time, the book offers an opportunity to provide a wealth of information on Shuar ethnology, on their cultural histories. So the authors are able to add a large ethnographic component to really contextualize that knowledge. And that's what a book offers. Another, I think, major advantage is that a book gives you as a writer an opportunity to synthesize your research, but also engage into a deep self-reflection and introspection of what you're doing, and provide you with a long-term research vision, right? That is something that is developed as you carry out your research, as you further develop it, but also as you continue writing about it. And I want to show here, I'm not sure if you can see me now that I'm sharing my screen, but I'm going to uphold it. If you can't see me, then I'll show it again at the end. Just ask me. But this is the first book. It's a guidebook that I decided to write in 2003. It's written in Spanish. It's self-published. It's also falling apart because it's self-published. So whatever publishing option you choose, there are pros and cons, and we can talk more about that at the end. So this was a work in collaboration with a PhD student. I was a postdoc at that moment in time, but together with my PhD student and with a group of 8 traditional healers with whom we collaborated in Bolivia, we wrote this book together. So I already talked about making a synthesis of your research, engaging in a sustained self-reflection. Rick touched upon that already, right? That you're able to, depending on how you structure your book, that you're able to reach a wider audience, not just the scholars who are interested in similar research as you are doing, but if you're able to cross boundaries and write in a way that it is accessible to a broader audience, then you have that opportunity with a book. And I think a final reason is that if you bring, for example, if you develop a book or prepare a book around giving an overview of methodologies like Miguel Alexiades has done, you have the opportunity to develop a book that will be used for educational purposes, but also to guide individual researchers while they are doing their field work. So a book has a lot of opportunities, and basically you're building your own legacy of what you have been doing in research in collaboration with the people you have been working with. So like I said, I'm a series editor for Advances in Economic Botany that was formerly published by the New York Botanical Garden Press and currently by Springer and NYBG together. And this is an interdisciplinary book series that aims at integrating not only basic research, but also bringing an applied component, and deals with book topics, book series topics that are developed around people, plants, and environment relationships worldwide. So let's not get stuck on the word economic in the title. And that would be a great new manuscript, challenging the economic in ethnobotany. But the series is really, and that's my hope for it, being the series editor, that it is an ethnobotany series in which a lot of people can find a sort of niche to publish their books. So the type of books that have been published in this series, Advances in Economic Botany, there are currently 4 types. But like I said, let's not think that these are the only way in which you can develop a book. I'm very open to hearing new proposals. So one of them, and I'll show you examples of each of these 4 types of formats of books, is Proceedings of a Symposium. The second one is a synthesis, a sort of, big deep dive into a specific topic of interest to ethnobotany. A third type of books in the series is a treatise on human management of plants and ecosystems. And then finally, a focus on new concepts, trends, or methods in ethnobotany. So let me show you some example of each of these 4 formats. One is the Proceedings of a Symposium. And this was actually a book from 1983. It's 156 pages. And it's the proceeding of a symposium that was organized by the Society for Economic Botany, and it's about ethnobotany in the neotropics. So here, and that's also important for prospective authors, is how do you position yourself? Do you and maybe a couple colleagues want to be the sole author of the book? Something that really reflects your research, or that of you and your colleagues? Or do you instead choose to be an editor of the book, and then you will be responsible for selecting different authors who each contribute a chapter? You as an editor can contribute a chapter as well, but moreover, your work will be to tie these different chapters together into answering a research question or telling a story. So the second format, the second type of book, is an in-depth treatment of a specific topic of interest. And here you see a book from 2017, and it's also, I like this very much. It's not only talking about a plant that has ethnobotanical and also economic value, vanilla and vanilla species, but also integrating ethnographic and cultural anthropology information about the landscape, that the cultural landscape, the natural landscape that vanilla in Madagascar is a part of. This is another example, Bark by Anthony Cunningham. It's a pretty applied approach. A lot of tree species have bark, and this bark is used. Unfortunately, they're often also over-harvested, so we need adequate conservation and resource management strategies. And again, this is an edited volume bringing together contributions from different authors. This is another example of a synthesis or in-depth treatment of a specific topic of interest, the acai palm in the Amazon. So that's species of Euterpe, and the caboclo farmers who harvest and farm these species in the Amazon, and how actually also the story of how the acai fruit has evolved from a rural staple to a sort of modern hyped food that is available in international markets, and tying this ethnobotanical topic in with the stigmatized history of the social identity of caboclos in the Amazon. So the third type of book is looking into human management of ecosystems or plants. I'm showing you two examples here. One is from the Peruvian Amazon about slash and burn agroforestry as a way of managing and agriculture agricultural lifestyle and produce for small scale farmers, family farmers. And then this is from the same authors a year later, Christine Paddock and others, looking into different ecosystems in Amazonia, the whitewater floodplains, and also looking at this topic from different angles. So then the fourth and final type of manuscript that we've received in this series, and this is one that I grew up with as an ethnobotanist, is Selected Guidelines for Ethnobotanical Research, a field manual. So this is really a textbook, has been my guide in research, providing essential guidelines for conducting research and collecting plants. So this is an example of a perspective. The next one is of a method. This is an example of a perspective, combining the topics and perspective of conservation of biocultural diversity within the field of ethnobotany. So like I said, I want to emphasize that new ideas for book topics are most welcome, and that, you know, I think in the field we should also try to be more diverse, because a lot of the publications that have come out have traditionally focused around researchers who are based in the North, and that we also need to take into account you know, a researcher from the global South. And I was talking a lot with Eric Stannard from Springer about this, because of course, online translation is not being covered by publishers. I think it might develop, it might depend from publisher to publisher. So I'm talking here about my perspective editing the series Advances in Economic Botany. However, Eric Stannard told me that Springer has been using successfully a sort of translation software that gave great results. I haven't tested it out, so I don't know, but that it would still remain up to the prospective author of then checking how the English and the translation turned out. But this is definitely also something that we as series editors, authors, and leadership in the society need to continue advocating for. Be inclusive, try to incorporate different languages into our publishing, into our scholarship as well. So here's to say that I'm really welcoming new ideas that can be new methods, new approaches, emerging topics, urgent perspectives. I think we also need to keep our focus very interdisciplinary. So go broad, go deep. Like Rick said, keep connecting with the general public, but always based on good science. Develop country level or regional works. Another thing is also, you know, I showed you the Symposium paper in the beginning. I think, you know, workshops paper, if you have had an intensive workshop for several days, you can develop a book around that as well. White papers or any other ideas. So then, let's say, how do you go about to pitch your manuscript to a publisher? So that starts first, like Rick said, read to write, right? I would add to that also, review what has been published, do your homework to know where you want to pitch your book manuscript, how you would shape your idea. So first of all, where you want to pitch it is which publisher, but also how you would shape and formulate your idea. Because one of the things that you have to do is make the case that what you bring to the editor and to the publishers, that's original. It has a novelty aspect. It hasn't been published before. So you have to really write a summary of your book idea, discuss it with a book editor, with a series editor, those of us who are your best advocates to defend your manuscript to the publisher. So we're kind of the ones, it's one of the hoops you have to jump through. So focus a lot of time and intention and dedication into formulating a good summary of your idea and advocate for it in what you write. And you can only do that if you've done your homework and you've reviewed the literature. So let's say you've done all that, you've talked with an editor, a series editor, or a book editor, and you've received a book proposal form, and you want to continue with your book idea. So this proposal form is a sort of planning tool for the publisher, but it also will allow them, together with your CV and a sample chapter, to get a good idea of what you want to write in your book. So it goes hand in hand with the summary, but it adds more to it. You develop a content, you will tell what your different chapters will be about. If you decide to edit a book and you want to draw in multiple authors, you have you have titles for these chapters ready, and you have a sample chapter. So that will then go to the publisher and the editor, and they will send it out to reviewers, and then you will receive feedback from the reviewers and the editor and the publisher. You will receive some recommendations, right? So that there will be an assessment. And once you've passed through that hoop as well, then that's where a contract is drawn up between the publisher and the author that will guide the author further in the submission process and outlines the responsibilities. And this is the time when you either prepare your manuscript or you have a manuscript already that you then have adapted based on the feedback that you got from the reviewers. So my last slide, let's say you've jumped through all these hoops, you have your manuscript written after 6 months, after a year. That is also something that you stipulate a submission date on the contract. You have submitted the manuscript. That isn't yet the time where you say, oh, now I'm going to lean back and the hard work is over. And that's important to be in that mindset where you prepare yourself, right? Then the manuscript is sent out to reviewers. They will give you feedback and you need to rework and resubmit the manuscript again. Let's say you have done all that already, and after sinking into desperation for a day, like you see here on the cartoon, don't get frustrated, keep working, set it out. The process is still not finished. There will be requests from the publisher to provide the short biography, other materials, sort of summary of the book, pitching the book to the audience. But then there is still the lengthy process of production revisions, meaning the production office at the publisher will get back to you with a manuscript and you're going to read through it again. You will find errors. They will have queries for you. For example, you will be very unhappy about where they put your figure or your table. So you make those revisions, you send it back. They send it back to you for approve again. You're still finding errors. You're still finding small things that you want to change. It can never be about, I'm going to rewrite half of my book manuscript. At that point, that's not possible. But there will be a lot of back and forth on small things. And that can be very frustrating, as well. So to end my presentation, writing a book is a lengthy process, and it involves all your energy and your dedication. But once it comes out, you've quickly forgotten that. When I wrote my first book, this one in 2003, I said, I'm never gonna write one again. And I've since 17 years later, wrote 4 more again in collaboration with authors. So my recommendation is find people you want to work with, and keep working at it. It's worth it. I really like doing it. I even like the frustration of it, believe it. So thank you. So I'm very interested in hearing what your questions are.
Great, thanks, Ina. Before we hop into any new questions, I've just been copying and pasting some of the old ones we didn't get around to. Oh, and now it's not going to let me copy and paste them. But we'll go one at a time. So Ina, if you can take a look in the chat, I have some older questions for you that we didn't get around to.
Let me look. Where are we? Betsabe. So where Betsabe wrote, I think that's where we're picking up. Is everyone with me on that?
If you hop right down to the bottom, I've copied and pasted them all for you.
Oh. So speaking of languages, Betsabe, is it better to publish in English to be read by broader audiences and colleagues in the field, or would a bilingual book be welcome? Have you come across any examples like this? I ask because I struggle thinking of when I reach that stage is what language I should publish in, Spanish, English, or both. So Betsabe, I think a really wonderful question. It depends on the publisher. So Springer is only publishing in English, but I've self-published books as well in Spanish. Working with the communities I work with, I think it's important to do both. So there are opportunities of doing both, but not all of these opportunities might be the easiest routes. For example, for writing the books that I wrote in Spanish, this is the other one, I had to find funding, because once you're self-funding, you have to find a project to fund printing that book. And definitely that's an experience as well. So I would just say, what you would like to do, go for it and find ways to do it. The data and information age can age quickly unless there is an overriding synthesis of ideas that is profound and stimulating beyond the time of publication. Do you try to create models of knowledge that goes beyond information? I think it's a really good question, and I think Rick can also comment on that. I'll start off. I don't know. I think for me, my approach would be, again, to do both. I don't think that data from an earlier time is necessarily less valued because traditional knowledge transforms. It is a way to go back and see how traditional knowledge transforms. So that data to me is very valid, even though it may have been written 20 years ago. But I do agree that we should go beyond just publishing books about plant uses. And that's where the cross-disciplinarity comes in and is so important. We need to contextualize our data. We need to stop focusing only on plants or only on communities. These are worldviews, and we need to be good allies and advocates for that. We shouldn't disintegrate knowledge, traditional knowledge systems, because that's what science has taught us. Rick, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, you answered that very well. The only thing I would add, that sort of the broader debate here, and this goes back, the beginnings of the field, and this idea of the list making. And we saw the journal undergo this transition where if you go back to issues of the journal from the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, you see a lot of these just simple lists of plants. And certainly under Dan's editorship, that transition to more theoretically based papers. There's nothing inherently wrong with the list making. I mean, that is the raw material. That's the natural history. But taking it and making it say something, I think, is quite important. And so books can do that because you have that space to really approach it in that way.
Betsabe comments on using DeepL for translation efforts. Thank you, Betsabe. I don't know that software, but I'm gonna look into it. But I agree, Tanika Conecero, I hope I'm pronouncing your family name correctly. She says no translation systems can replace humans, and that's of course very correct. Jessica Dolan is asking if we're combining historical archival research with community-based ethnographic and scientific data. Is it the publishers who help us understand the process of obtaining permission from the historical archives, museums? How can we find guidance on that? That would be, I think, a question that you should ask the editor to ask the publisher wherever you want to publish. My initial reaction, I don't know, I haven't done that, but would be that the author should try to gain that access. Rick, do you have other insights into that?
Yeah, well, there are some books out there. I want to say that the edited volume that Jan Salek put out, Curating Biocultural Collections, talks about that a little bit. If it's not there, it's somewhere else. If you don't find it there, let me know. But I would say most publishers aren't going to be that helpful, and publishers will be helpful in terms of the legal framework, so they don't get in trouble. But in terms of the sort of ethical guidance and the permissions type of stuff, I think they're going to put that on the authors. Now, the nice thing is librarians can be really helpful in that regard. Good research librarians, they're is literally sitting there waiting to hear from people like you to collaborate and to go through that. At our own library, for example, one of our former PhD students, she's now she's in charge of the anthropology library, and she does a great job of helping both faculty and students to with matters like this. So there's plenty of people that can help.
Thanks, Rick. That's a good point. Ask the people who work in the archives. Katie also said, as the archives and museums, most have an agreement for publication of images and materials. You have to sign an agreement, and in small print, acknowledgements are there for publications. Okay, Carson, now I see the comments and questions that you had republished. It would be great to get insight on how to best approach publishers, especially for books targeting wider public awareness. So I tried to answer that during my presentation. So you approach the editor who advocates on your behalf to the publisher. So I think you have to find allyship there with editors. What is the best pitching strategy? What works? What type of agreements are out there? Maybe this is covered later in the presentation. What is the best pitching strategy? I think publishers are pretty much aware that the field needs to be diverse, sensitive, inclusive, and that reaching the general public is very important. So I would emphasize that when you write your summary of your book proposal or your book idea. Also speaking of, so this is Betsabe again. Data and information can age quickly. We talked about that. What about herbals or plant use type of book? You didn't mention it. I was wondering if there is a reason. Well, so actually, this last book, this is a volume that I just published with my colleague, edited for the Advances in Economic Botany series. It's not a herbal, but it has 25 monographs of popular plants in the two communities where we worked, in an urban area in Jamaica and in rural Jamaica. So my colleague and I here positioned ourselves as editors because the authors of the traditional knowledge are and remain the traditional knowledge holders and their communities. But that is also an opportunity that was under the category, a sort of synthesis of a topic. What we did is not only just write 25 plant monographs, but also write an introduction that ties together the book. How was your self-publishing process, Katie? Thank you for asking that question. It wasn't easy. But again, it required a sustained commitment to the communities we work with, because as you know, a lot of researchers, that part of publishing a book at the end to give back to the communities was not necessarily a part of the budget of the grant, but it was in agreement with the communities in a negotiation agreement, because we asked them, what do you think of doing the research, and what is it that you want out of it? And that's what they wanted. They say, we want to have, a book at the end in which the knowledge that different people here of us have about these plants can be brought together. They also had very specific ideas on how that knowledge should be represented, what should not be represented. And they really liked that the specific person who had contributed the knowledge was named in the book, right? So it wasn't part of the original research grant, but it was part of our agreement between researchers and community members. So there was a pressure, and I was doing a postdoc, and there was that pressure of finding that money to print a book, because once you do self-publishing, you have to find between $5,000 and $10,000 US to print, let's say 500 copies or 1,000 copies of a book. But
if I could just interject, I saw, I think Dan had his hand up. I'm not sure what it was in regard to. I was going to say that, I think a good model out there is to have the publisher pay for that too. And I think that's, if I recall, that's how Timber Press just added a little bit to the price in order to so that they could give copies to all the tribes mentioned in Native American Ethnobotany. Is that right, Dan? You're muted.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Not quite. Yes, they did help. Timber Press did help. But I also did some very informal kind of fundraising among colleagues and friends and, well, I don't know, my mother and my father, my network. And we sent copies of Native American Ethnobotany to every Native American and Canadian registered tribe, whether they're in the book or not. I mean, it seemed wrong not to do that.
Yeah.
So then how many copies were that? Because I think that's also the thing, right? A lot of publishers will give, let's say, a couple of books, but not necessarily 500 books or 1,000 books.
It was about 1,000.
Okay, that's great.
We tried to find out an address for a tribal library. And if we got that, that's where we sent it. And if we didn't get that, we found the tribal chairman and we sent it there and asked him to put it in the library. I mean, it was there's a lot of tribes and they range from the Navajos to to 9 guys in an island off the coast of Maine. So it was a difficult thing to do, but it felt good. And we got some really nice letters back that made it pay off, as it were.
Wonderful. Yeah. I see somebody say here that I'm currently working on a self-publishing project, which has been financially challenging. I think that's my experience also, but it's great to hear that there are opportunities out there, which also, these are things that we have to talk about more regularly, right? The tips of, how can we make something happen so we're not all reinventing the wheel over and over again. Yeah, so somebody also asked, where would you find financial help to self-publish if you want to distribute a book for free back to the community you're working with? So I got the money for self-publishing using a local press in Bolivia 2 times and 1 time in Jamaica, through the times in Bolivia through the Belgian Development Corporation. I'm originally from Belgium. And the last time it was a component of my National Geographic grant. So I think also more funders are now willing to put in a budget for that. I don't know the National Humanities, the government in Jamaica, in the US, Rick, do you have any, is that possible on NIH?
NSF, it is possible. You could build that into the costs. And it's an important point. You should be thinking about the output before you do anything. And so when you're out writing those grants, it's a lot easier with foundations to get those funds to do it, but certainly different governmental agencies, not to make this US centric, but also the US Agency for International Development, there's funds available, things like that. But private foundations certainly want to help. You have to go out and do the legwork to make it happen. But it just depends on what your in situation is within your university. There may be some internal grants or other places to look. I saw there's a question here that I just want to make sure we didn't run out of time, and we got to because it's been up there for a while, but about literary agents. Does there come a point when one should consider a literary agent for publishing ethnobotanical books? The answer is absolutely yes, if you want to reach a large general audience. If you want to write the next Botany of Desire, get an agent. I think you don't need an agent for working with academic presses. If the print run is going to be, say less than 2,000, it doesn't make sense. A literary agent probably wouldn't want to touch it. But in my experience, I've worked with one literary agent on a project, and the good ones can open doors for you. They do take significant cut. It's somewhere around 10% usually, but they know the industry, and so they can get you a better contract than you would otherwise. But because it's sort of a chicken or egg situation, in that if you haven't already published a book, they might be hesitant to work because they want to make sure that they're seeing income for themselves. And so they'd rather go with somebody that already has books out there. But if you have a good manuscript though, and you find the right agent, then and they're quite good at reading and understanding that something has a chance of success, they will get out there. And it's not just getting connected with the publisher. There's also all the publicity, the TV show circuit, the print media that covers it. I mean, it's the whole ecosystem devoted to publishing that literary agents will know more than you ever will, and nor should you, because you don't want to spend your time trying to call some TV show to get a slot on there to push your book.
Belinda wrote, I know it sounds daft, but I have bought a giant stapler so I can easily produce A5 booklets for local distribute. It doesn't sound daft. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think it is a commitment that we make to communities we work with in whatever format. We do what we do.
Yeah, make print-on-demand technology work for you, and that's a technology that is relatively new. You can, you talk about self-publishing. Sure, it's not cheap necessarily, but it's a lot cheaper than it used to be. And if you only need to publish a few copies, do print-on-demand and take them into the communities and make it happen. But ideally, you would have some financing from some sort of foundation or organization that you could really distribute it widely to a lot of people.
Dan, go ahead. I see Dan waving.
Yeah, and of course, these days, everybody can, anybody can read a blog. Your informants have iPhones. And so blog,
yeah.
or do what's the other one called? You write it yourself and it's online, and they just type the thing in and boom, there it is with images. It's great, and it doesn't cost anything. Well, you got to have an internet connection.
Right. So not in all regions, the internet connection is.
But there's a lot of places where people up and down the scale have internet connections and have if one of those little all the kids use them to go to school these days. When the kids go back to school, mom can use it. The something book, whatever it's called. The internet is just is very, very widely available, and a stapler is great if you can actually find those people to hand it to. But if they're a little more spread out than that, well, blog.
So a question here, are there any grants out there that support authors during the writing months? Yes, there are lots of foundations that provide fellowships for writing. One that comes immediately to mind is the Rachel Carson Center in Munich that has funded lots of colleagues to go there for 6 months or a year to write. But there's a lot of other possibilities out there as well. It's a matter of getting online and finding the foundation that connects with what your work is. We unfortunately I don't know of one that's specifically devoted to ethnobotany, but certainly you can craft your message in a way that's broad enough to fit into other foundations. There's plenty of foundations that want to support writing on the environment and human environment interactions. And so, just find one that works for you.
Rick, for the publish on demand, I have a question. How easy do you think that is outside US?
I think it's very easy outside US. I think a lot of this is done overseas in the first place. My understanding is that much of the print on demand actually comes out of China. And I don't know how, recent events last year have changed that dynamic. But certainly, it's just a matter of looking online and finding it. I found that the quality is sometimes a little bit less. You're not going to get archival acid-free paper from print on demand, but they're certainly robust enough as books that it's a good solution if there's nothing else to make it happen.
So Nerea said, is it possible to distribute a self-published book internationally or on request? I think that's also a good question. So if these books are crossing international borders, will customs not slap taxes on it?
That's interesting. I've carried suitcases of books across borders and never run into trouble, but your mileage may vary, as they say, and it probably depends on where you're going. And books are powerful objects in some countries. Even one book might upset them. So yeah, do the research beforehand. But generally, shipping, there's creative ways to ship things and get them into people's hands.
Yeah, I carried I think 20 books around. I was stopped by customs, and it was a really big, long, drawn out conversation on what the value of these books were. And I said, this is for distribution, this is not for profit, this is educational. They were still calculating, and at the end I didn't have to pay taxes, but yeah, there was some kind of long drawn out discussion about that. So I would really look into that.
This question that just came up: what balance needs to be struck in publishing between making the book widely available and publishing in a local language so informants and society can benefit? Informants are from a small linguistic group, maybe Macedonian. Is it better to publish in English or the local language? That at the end of the day, that's got to be your call, because you're going to know that probably better than anyone else. But I will say that it's not just, it shouldn't be an either or, and there's a lot of not entirely obvious benefits to publishing in local language. Obviously, the people get it in their hands, but in terms of what that means to a group of people to have somebody from the outside publish in their own language, it valorizes the language and culture in a pretty significant way. And you don't necessarily know what the effects of that are going to be, but they can be quite positive. So even if it's 20 people, it could really be significant. You also don't know what's going to happen to that book in 100 years. And the fact that it's there could be really meaningful for people down the road. And so if you can do both, it's unfortunate that English has become so dominant, and it's not necessarily English, but just have any one language being so dominant that it just makes it so easy to make that decision to just publish in English. But I think it's really important to have these native language publications for a number of reasons.
It's also the most respectful thing to do,
Of
I think.
course, yeah.
All right, we're all caught up on the questions. If anyone else has other questions for our speakers, please feel free to throw them in. And Ina, Rick, if you guys have anything else to say, also feel free to go off topic a bit, whatever you guys want.
Well, I just want to say thank you again to organizing this, and thanks to all you. Everyone should feel free to contact me by email if you have any particular questions. I'm more than glad to talk, and I hope we can keep this conversation moving forward. Maybe we should organize something for the Congress. Give a plug for Jamaica next year that Ina's organizing along with SEB and the ISE. I think it's going to be a long delayed meeting, but it's going to be a fabulous meeting. So I hope to see all of you there. And I'll make sure that this list of books gets sent out to everybody.
Thank you. I want to add to that. Yes, also feel free to send me an email with any other questions that may come up while you're digesting the stock. But I also want to say that I think it's maybe really important that we keep talking about this in our society meetings. So all the societies, when they come together, they have workshops and panels. So I think we also want to hear from you. And you don't have to be a writer to write a book. A lot of people, it is a process, it is a stumbling process, but as long as you're dedicated, passionate about what you do, and willing to work and rework and reread and going through that discomfort of, producing a book, developing a book, preparing a book, right? You can write a book. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you both very much for your time, and thank all of you for coming today. It's great to have you all here.
Bye.
Bye-bye.